Thank you. It's been great. Manizalis is fantastic, and I was very happy when I was first contacted that a conference like ISEA was dealing with themes such as peace, which I've been focusing on for the last four or 5 years as a sound practitioner. So in my keynote I spoke a little bit about the work that I've done since 2012 and the work that I'm committed to do for the next 4 years in the context of a large research project that brings in social scientists, anthropologists, ethnographers to look at conflict in different parts of the world and conflict at different stages, and using sound very much as the key methodology, if you like, to compare stories, compare narratives, and really kind of look at different regions in the world and see how things might relate to each other. Well, my take is art has always been socially engaged. We went through a period in the second half of the 20th century that certain art practices became a little less socially engaged. But I think practices such as any kind of art making, any kind of music making are inherently social, right? It's whether that comes to the fore or not, and I think there's different ways kind of approaching it. So the affordance, if you like, or the capacity for art making for social change it's well documented, and it's pretty clear from our history, be it music or be it visual arts or theater. I think that's or literature. So I think what we're doing now is, in a way, recovering from a period in which that wasn't at the fore for various historical reasons, which make sense in themselves. And we're now, I guess, creating new methodologies. Some of them, in fairness, come from a lot of the work in the 60s. We now, from a technological perspective, we have a very different ecology of things that are easily available, that we can, images, sounds that we can manipulate easily. When we're working in a social engaged participants, the technology does not need to be this thing that is complex and run by engineers and in itself could be a cause for a division, right? It can be something that can be handed out. It's related to technology that everybody uses. So that I think has helped a lot. And yeah, one thing that art I think can do is to tell narratives of conflict which are local and are community-based, and sometimes they are very different from the grand narratives that we hear from the press, or indeed from politicians. So I guess what needs to happen in an art context is that you need to be much more attuned to these subtleties. Often the message is either hidden, or perhaps there's a double meaning, or perhaps it's focused at a particular group of people, and I think that's all part of the challenges of getting this kind of conversation going, if you like. Yeah, it's interesting. So a lot of this is ongoing, and it requires constant dialogue and teasing out of words that, in the first instance, we think we all know what we mean by fieldwork, for example. Now, fieldwork for me is very different than what it is for an anthropologist, and it's very different from a social scientist. So little things like that are important to kind of tune in, and there's no amount of pre-planning, I think, that can do it. I think it's the experience of going through a project that asks questions and that deals with very real situations, sometimes challenging situations in terms of the time in which certain things need to be done, and it's by kind of comparing that. So in a way, we're in the middle of that process. For me, what we're doing in August is to go back. I'm going back to Maré in Rio with an anthropologist to, I guess, do an ethnography study, a formal ethnography study, if you like, with the participants that worked on the Maré project in 2014. So that will help me, I think, first of all, get a sense of what the impact of the project was, working with somebody else that's not me directly, and also have this shared of methodologies. So I haven't worked directly in Colombia. The collective that I'm currently working with, Be Another Lab, they're based in Barcelona. One of the members is Colombian, and they have done a project here using embodied VR. I think, like with any situation, I think first you need to understand what the situation is. and there's a danger of generalizing. Things like post-conflict, again, is a word that means very different things depending on where you are in the world, right? So I think the power, if you like, of these kind of strategies is to be localized, is to tell a story in a very localized way, in a way that other people think, oh yeah, well that's very similar to that other story, and that other story could be here in the same community, or could be in a different part of the world. But to be able to tell those stories, you need to listen first. You need to go through a process in which you try as much as possible, try and understand the dynamics of a particular community that we're working with. And in a way, try to go with a clean agenda and try to kind of forget, because take the case of all post-conflict regions, there's a meta-narrative there of where they are in the process, the things that have happened, how you got to that stage, what the conflict was in the first place. If you talk to kind of people on the ground, the story can be very different from that, and I think it's important to capture those issues. I was hearing a very sad story recently of someone from Somalia who fled and is in a refugee camp, and a UN party looked at this woman in the middle of the camp, and she was lost. She was kind of looking around with nowhere to go. And they talked to her, trying to understand what her situation was, and it turns out she left Somalia with 4 kids and arrived at the refugee camp with none. So they all died in the way. And the UN people were there, with their humanitarian pack and with a tent, and expecting this person to have what's normally called resilience, and to kind of build that. And in a way, it's kind of totally it's an over expectation that somebody who has just gone through that, you get a pack in a tent and all of a sudden everything's okay. So I think one needs to be tuned to the subtleties and the nuances of the personal experience, and find ways of communicating that in a way that's readable for a wider public, if you like. And we need to be prepared for an element of contradiction as well. So what we have, so if you're in government, there's great pressure for you to have one narrative for what's happened in your country, right? Otherwise it'll be impossible to do anything, right? Yeah. So a lot of resource and effort goes into constructing that narrative, right? And to make that narrative cohesive to a certain extent, right? Building all the parties in the broad sense of the word, bringing all the parties in, have discussion, compromise, and have something that's workable, right? And that's a story, that's a form of identity that gets created both at regional level and at national level, and that's to some extent required from the perspective of a government. From an art perspective, that's not required. In fact, that's not a positive thing, right? You want things that clash with each other, because what you have is you don't need a general theory of art or a general history of art. You have a proliferation of projects. Some of them can cluster and follow the same kind of procedure or say similar things. Others can be completely contradictory, and that contradiction can be a very valid thing. Right, and I think the more in a way contradiction there is, the more the experiencer, the person who needs to engage with either art making or looking at art or listening to art, needs to make up their own mind, because you have these two things that don't add up to one story, and I think that's a healthy situation.